Hello, everyone. Good morning. All right. Just give me a second. All right, fine. So once again, good morning, and let's start the session. So today we are going to start with the asynchronous mode of programming. Till now, whatever we were doing that was synchronous. You created the class and you have executed those class. So everything, whatever we did so far, was synchronous. That was synchronous. So after this, we have another topic that's trigger. Trigger is also synchronous. After that, we have the last topic, test classes. Test classes are also synchronous. Basically, when we are going to study the asynchronous programming, first of all, let me tell you that how many topics, how many things are there inside Apex programming, which we execute asynchronously. And rest every other thing is synchronous. And this is a very common interview question. And people sometimes people sometimes they are unable to identify which one is asynchronous and which one is synchronous. So I'm just telling you that there's a simple way to understand. Sometimes might happens that interviewer would ask you a question: Have you worked on asynchronous programming? And you say yes, of course, I have worked. And then can you please tell me like which which programmings are what sort of programming type of programming they falls in synchronous and what of they comes under asynchronous. So probably that time you make yourself a little bit confused. Why? Because in the beginning, we don't clearly have that understanding. So could you please, every one of you, take a pen and paper, just write it down. So in asynchronous programming, we are going to learn four things. And that are the only four concepts which are executed asynchronously. I'm going to tell you exactly what is the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. Don't worry about that. That is the reason why I have opened this diagram. I'll be telling you this, don't worry. Don't worry. But in the beginning itself, I wanted to make a note of this. There are four things that comes. There are four programming entities that comes in the asynchronous programming. And rest every other ever we learned comes under synchronous. So what are those four things? Please write down. Batch programming, batch, batch programming, this one. And then future method, future method, queuable interface, and schedulable program, scheduled interface. So literally there are only four things. Flex queue is just a concept only. That's just a theoretical concept. We're going to learn it separately, although, but that have a relationship, but that's not a program. So asynchronous operations in Apex programming, there are four different forms of asynchronous programming. There are four different programming entities that are executed asynchronously, and they are bash program, schedulable program, future methods, and queuable methods, queuable interfaces. So these are the four entities. Apart from these four, every other thing, whatever we have learned, like we learn how to write down an Apex program using classes. एंड हाँ, एक बात थोड़ा सा मुझे याद आ गई, शायद कल या परसों की, आई गेस परसों की बात है ये. There was an interview going on, and why I used to say this. See, you are from 208 batch. And guys, those who are from like 203, 4, and 5, 201 and 2, that's almost have been placed out. Or maybe they are not in contact with me properly. So that's why I don't have the proper status of them. But at least the last news, what I know is they almost have been placed out. But guys from 20, I guess 204, 5, 6, and 7 to Bananita. So they are still, they are still, some of them are preparing, some of them are giving interviews, some of them are still not ready, and they lost in their life. So what actually happens is like, when somebody would start with this, I always used to say that, see, this is a long training. It's a long training. It requires patience and you have to maintain that torque throughout your throughout your syllabus. People usually start with a lot of zeal. People usually start with a full of energy, and gradually it's a human tendency. As the time goes, it dilutes everything. But in this case, you don't have to do that. So, in the beginning itself, we try to make you aware that you are going to be getting engaged for almost 1.5 year, 1 year from our side, half year from your side. So there are so many of them, who, while we discuss with the mentors, they say that they are facing difficulties while giving interview, why? Because of the connectivity or everything. So we propose a solution to them. We have a place where we used to say, this is my home, and we have like we set up a workspace over here inside in my home. That the separate floor actually. My family lives in the ground floor. I'm talking about the first floor of my building. So we have set up this over here, like we used to sit over here because most of us are having work from home. So we require a place there where we can sit, we can work, we can talk, and we can even help each other. I mean, initially it started just with a room. Then I have engaged the second room as well. We created a small setup over there. If somebody of you wanted to give the interview from our place, we are not going to help you out. Don't think like that. But yeah, we can just provide you an infrastructure where you can sit and you'll have a good internet, a good connectivity, and everything. So I just heard that question interviewer was asking, what are the different access specifiers that we can give to a class? The guy who was sitting for the interview has applied as a fresher. Whenever somebody applies as a fresher, we used to give them at least an internship experience. We used to say them that you can write down an internship experience of like 2 years or 1.5 years, 1.8 years. And we will provide you that certificate free of cost. That's a part of your training, even for you guys as well. When you will come to that point, we're going to have that discussion. That would be an open discussion with your batch. So, मुद्दे वाली बात पर आते हैं. So the interviewer has asked, what are the different forms or how many different types of access specifiers you can give to a class? And then see this, you don't concentrate on the thing what he is asking. You're in so hurry to give the answer. If you know the answer, you're in so much hurry. And sometimes this happens like you just messed up with what you're saying. And he started explaining there are 4 types of access specifiers: public, protected, global, private. And then this is what this is what this is. And during in that flow, he just forgot to mention that protected cannot be an access specifier for a class. For a class, protected cannot be the access specifier. There, yes, of course. In ideal circumstances, if I was being asked this question, if this question was being asked to me, then my answer would be, although in Apex programming, there are 4 different forms of access specifiers: public, private, protected, and global. But when we consider Apex class, out of those 4, we can only apply 3. A class could be a public class could also be a private, class could also be global. And I can give you the example, but class cannot be a protected class. And I'll extend my answer. See, protected is, if you ask me like where does we are going to use the protected, so protected can be the methods inside the class. Methods could be protected. And what happens when a method is protected? Why? What is the use of protected? So protected methods can inherit protected. I mean, what is the functionality which you have defined? If you created a method and that if you define that method as protected, and by the way, from this class, you have any inherited class. There, if this class where you define this method is parent class and there is an inherited child class, then that child class could have, that child class could have the functionality of protected. But apart from that class, no other class would going to have that. So only the derived classes could get the functionality of parent in terms if it is protected. If it is not protected, then everyone could get it. If it's a public, like see what we do. What we do. Whenever we define a class access specifier is what? Public. Even the methods, whatever I have defined, like there's a method, this method, the method access specifier is also public. In that case, see, any of class could access this method, anyone. If I would make it protected, if I would make this method as protected, then the classes which are derived from this class, only they can have. They can ask for the functionality of this method and no one else. That is what he was trying to ask. And then he just messed up with everything. He said, like, he defined everything. This public is protected, and the public is used for that. Normally, the classes are public. Private we have used when the classes, the test, when we create a test class, it was private. When we create an API during integrations, that time the APIs we are having access specifiers as global. Even then, he don't realize. So, see, this is my point of view always. Don't be in hurry. Don't be in hurry to give the answers. Don't be in hurry to give the answers. Whenever they would ask you a question, try to develop a tendency to repeat that question. This gives you a time when, see, if for example, I'm your interviewer, I'll ask you, could you please explain me how many different forms of access specifiers are there for a class? In an Apex class, what type of different access specifiers that you can use? So before giving the answer, oh, yes, so you wanted me to explain, if you define a class, how many different forms of access specifier that class could have? Elaborate the question. Elaborate the question. And ask this, make a cross questioning about his question. Okay, you wanted me to explain that if I would define a class in Apex programming, like how many different forms of access specifiers it could have? As this is your question? He said, yes. See, this is like, when you do this, you get the time to think of that and to prepare your answer. Right? These are the ways, these are the ways. First, the interviewer had this expression, you always take a confirmation on the kind of requirement, and you are never in a hurry to start your work. You always take in confirmation, which is a good thing, because in real time also you have to do that. Whenever a requirement would be get submitted to you, first of all would have to make an confirmation. Oh, this is my requirement. This is something what we wanted to develop. And once you are once you are not roaming in a cloud, once you have a clear understanding on everything, then you start doing your work. So see, interviews are always about how you are giving and very less about what you are giving. But we always concentrate on what answer we are there, not on how the answers we are doing. Right? Giving, I don't know, I have told you that or not. Abhi jo mera present company, Royal Cyber. When I was being interviewed for that, I mean, the person who was taking my interview has asked me to write down certain codes. I mean, I did that. Then I fed up, and he asked me to create a trigger for something. I said, no, I'm not going to trigger. I'm not going to do that. Why? Why should I do? You ask me, okay, one or two would be enough, like to understand how much programming knowledge or how much depth I am having into this. But then why you are asking me to do this again and again and again? Because I am applying for a separate position. I'm not applying for a developer position in here. I'm applying for this position. And this is in this position, I'm not supposed to write code for myself. Then he asked me what you are supposed to do. I said, you write down this code. I'm going to talk to my staff. You write down this code. What the question, what you're asking me, the trigger, what you're asking me to write. Can you please write down that trigger? Give it to me. I'll optimize that trigger for you. So see, this was the thing. This was even I have denied to write down, but I got selected. Basically, कैसा है ना? Interviews are something else. You think of something else. चलो वापस आते हैं. So asynchronous programming, they are very important. They are very important aspect of programming. There are 4 different forms of that. You're going to learn all of them. Batch programming, schedulable programming. These two are programming. These two are classes. Batch is a class. Schedulable is a class. Batch is a class. Listen this carefully. Batch is a class. Schedulable is also a class that can be scheduled to run periodically. We're going to learn everything in detail, so don't worry. I'm going to explain. I'm just trying to introduce the topics, the upcoming topics. Future is a method. It's not a class. Future is a method. Queuable is a method. And these are defined under the classes. There would be a class. Inside that class, if there are 5 methods, I can make one of them as future method. Inside in a class, if there are 5 methods, I can make one of them as queuable. So queuable and future, these are methods. These are not the name of the classes. Classes are not. Classes are either a batch class or a schedulable class. All right, we're going to see them everything in detail. But apart from that, whatever we have learned, we are going to learn. Like after this, we are going to learn with triggers. After triggers, we are going to learn test classes. After test classes, I'm going to start with integrations. During integration, you're going to learn how to write down the web services, the APIs, application program interfaces. So everything out of these 4 are synchronous. The programs that you have created so far, the programs you are going to create in future, apart from that, apart from these 4 things, everything is synchronous. Now let's understand what is the difference between synchronous operation and asynchronous operation. Difference between synchronous programming and asynchronous programming. All right. See, what happens, see, if I have built up a program, if I would take you to the developer console, and we created this kind of programs, like this was a program. This program have different methods. This program have different methods. Whenever I wanted to execute, my first question would be like, where I have wrote this all program? Where I have wrote this? Do I have written this inside any tool with my computer? No. This is another browser. You can see the URL, right? This is another browser. That's a feature of force.com. Force.com gave you that platform. Just a second. So early in call. 1 second. All right. So see, This program what we have executed, I haven't used any editor which is installed on my system. Rather, this one is an URL. The first thing where I wrote the program, the editor was online. This was an online editor. When I executed that, when I executed this program, I used execute anonymous window for that. This is another tool, but this is again a cloud tool. All right. When this program was being executed, we used to see the results, right? We used to see the results and everything. First of all, that program, where does that program is executed? Is that program executed from my computer? Like, do I have this whole compilers and everything? No, they were there inside Apex runtime engine. Where is that runtime engine? Inside force.com. So see, the whole process, that was being committing is committing from some other place and not from our system. So in this type of system, this kind of programming is called as client server, where we are client, our system, this computer, this laptop, from where you are programming, you're typing your program, you're saving that program, and then you're programming, you're sending this program for the execution. So that entire program, that entire computer is called as client. Your computer is called as client. You are called as client. When you submit that program, when you save that program and you ask to execute that program, this is called as a request. This is called as a request. Now, this request has been given to the server. Server in this case would be force.com. And force.com have a dedicated Apex runtime engine. There is a program. There is a separate tool, Apex runtime engine, which is responsible to execute this whole thing. All right, let's try to make it more simpler. Let's talk about the general terminologies and not go into detail. So your computer becomes client, the force.com becomes the server. So you send a request. That means you have given a program, for execution. Now that request goes to server, force.com. Inside force.com, there is Apex runtime engine. That runtime engine compilers would perform the execution. And they would give you that response back in the form of log files, whatever we use to evaluate. The log is generated means the program is executed. The response has been come back. So that log file was the response. So what happens in synchronous mode is like you submitted a request. That request goes to force.com server. Force.com has Apex runtime engine. It would execute that request and it would generate a response in the form of an HTML file. We used to call that as a log file. And that log file is getting transferred to the client. And we can see that. Now, after that, we created, for example, let's consider for this request, let's say maybe 10 seconds was required. Just an example. Itna duration to nahi lagta hai. Then you cannot perform any operation within those 10 seconds. Now let's consider after that response have been received, you initiated another request. You send another program for the execution. That program is little complicated and it would require more time. For example, it would require, let's say, 30 seconds. And after 30 seconds, that program was being executed. Server has generated a log file and that response was sent back to the client. So you see that. But for that 30 seconds, this client become idle. It cannot perform any operation for the next 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, once he got the response back, he would generate another request. Request number 3. That request number 3 has been submitted to server. And that request is even more complicated, would require a significant amount of time, maybe like 5 minutes. Let's consider that 5 minutes. So within those 5 minutes, the client becomes idle and it cannot submit any other request. So this means one request at a time. If I wanted to summarize this, normal synchronous programming, what happens is like the client could submit only one request at a time until the time he did not get the response of previously submitted request. For example, the moment when he was having request R2 ready, He was having a request number 2 ready with him. All right, the request number 2, R2 is ready, but he cannot send that. He cannot push that request. He cannot give that request to server. Why? Because before R2 could be submitted, he have not received the response of R1. So that means a request cannot be submitted to server unless you have received the response of previously submitted request. If server is working on a previously submitted request, if it's processing that previous request, he cannot allow you to send another request. If server is processing R1, till the time R1 would got finished, he cannot process R2. Cannot process R2. If it's processing R2, right now, if it is busy with R2, executing the R2, it cannot process R3. So in this mode of execution, client, let's talk from the client perspective. Let's talk from the client's end. Client cannot submit a request unless he get the response of previously submitted request. You cannot submit R2 unless you have response of R. You cannot submit R3 unless you have a response of R2. That was from the client. And server would not going to process any another request if he already is holding a request. If it's working on a request, if it's working on a job, if it is executing one program, it will not take any another program into consideration. So it would be always one request at a time. This is what is called as synchronous. And by the way, everything, whatever we learn, Apex program, we are going to learn triggers, test classes, and application program interfaces. All of them runs synchronously. Even your business automations like workflow, process builder, and your flows, all of them even runs synchronously. Apart from these 4 things which we are going to start, every other thing runs, every other thing is executed this way only, synchronously. Right? So this is what is synchronous execution. Now let's talk about the second way. Now let's come to the asynchronous part. So when we are learning asynchronous programming, in the asynchronous programming, server is even capable to hold some request. Now, for example, if R1 was like the request one, R1 was sent from the client and server has started, the runtime engines have started working on R1. They have started processing R1. They are working on R1. They are executing on R1. If server is busy with R1, if server is involved with R1, but he could even, apart from R1, he could also hold some other request. He allows you to send some request, although he would going to execute them one by one. See, the execution is always one. It's not multi-processing. People usually make themselves confused with multi-processing. This is not multi-processing system. This is not a multi-processing system. If you are a computer engineer, you have learned something like this. Multi-processing, by the way, this is not a multi-processing system. Here, the processing of only one program is doing. There's another way. There's another. See, with the synchronous, you don't have a possibility even to send the request. I'm just talking about sending of request. How many requests you could send in this synchronous? Only one request. Only one request at a time. This is what I'm talking. All right. So don't make yourself deviated apart from this. What I'm saying. Don't make unnecessary assumptions. But in an asynchronous programming, like for example, the request R1 was being submitted to server. And server right now is processing R1. The R1 was completed, so response was being generated, so R1 has been given back. All right, let's consider that was a small request. And now R2 have been submitted. Now R2 have been given to server. And so server right now is busy with R2. Right? Server right now is busy with R2. It's processing R2. One request at a time. Server would always execute one request. But in asynchronous programming, runtime engine even allows you to send some requests. They are not going to get executed. But there is a place where these requests can stand. There is a place where these requests can hold up for certain time. And this place is called as Apex queue. Q is a form of memory. Q is a form of memory. Actually, data structure एक सब्जेक्ट हम लोगों ने पढ़ा था ग्रेजुएशन में. उसमें हमने पढ़ा कि memories they have been visualized, the memories they have been visualized or they have been seen in different forms. Like stack is a form of memory, queue is a form of memory, heap is a form of memory, है ना? So queue is a memory by the way. जैसे आपने पढ़ा है workflow, workflow. कोई बता सकता है मैंने workflow queue कहाँ पढ़ाया था? Yes, what is the purpose of workflow queue by the workflow queue मैंने आपको बताया था. What is the purpose of workflow queue? Yes, can anyone of you tell me that? What is the purpose of workflow queue? Don't Google an answer. You know the answer, just tell me. Okay, that's good to know. That's good to know. All of you are on the same ship, right? Titanic. All of you are on the sitting on the same ship. Very good. And this is what is your progress. So workflow queue is used during time-dependent action. There are two types of workflow, isn't it? There are two forms of work. There are two types of action. Immediate action and time-dependent action. You remember that? Whenever you schedule certain operations, whenever you create a time-dependent action that goes to a place, that place is workflow. So every time-dependent action goes to a place called as workflow queue, and from there they have executed. See, every time this happens, I ask you a question, you don't give the answer, I'll have to repeat that topic. If you wanted to see, go to time-based workflow. Go to time-based work. This is the place. This is the place, right? This is where the workflow queue. So you don't have a job over here right now. Everyone is executed, but this is that place. So queue is a form of memory to store something. Let's come back. In the asynchronous program, if you have submitted, let's say R2, R1 submit हुआ, execute होके चला गया, R2 आया. Now server is processing R2. At this moment, when server still is busy with R2, client is allowed to send more requests. Like in synchronous programming, client was ideal. Client remains in an ideal state till the time it would get the response of previously submitted request. That means if R1, if server is processing R1, you cannot send R2. If server now is processing R2, you cannot send R3. That is synchronous. But in asynchronous, client is allowed to send few requests. How many of them? Five. You can send 5 more requests even when server is processing the previous one. So if server is processing R2, you can send R3, R4, R5, R6, R7. 5 jobs, 5 requests, 5 jobs you can push, you can give it to server. Although all 5 of them, all 6 of them rather, 5 from 5 which you have submitted, 1 which is already executing. They are not going to simultaneously get executed. It's not a multi-processing. The processing of them would be done one by one only, like how the server executes them in synchronous. This thing is common, but only the difference is you can submit a request, which is not even possible. You cannot even submit a request in synchronous programming, but here you can submit that. So what is a place where this all request goes? What is that place? There must be some certain waiting area. Yes, there is a waiting area. Apex queue. So apex queue is that theoretical form of memory. Apex queue is that theoretical form of memory which is used by the runtime engines, the Apex compilers, to hold on certain requests, to hold the request, to hold those jobs which are going to be executed after this. So this is why, see, the asynchronous programming is all possible just because of memory called as Apex queue. And we are going to learn some other features as well. But Apex queue is that form of memory which allows to hold the ready to execute job, ready to execute jobs that have been submitted for the execution. Because whatever is not ready is there inside this place, RN. If you are constructing a program, you're doing your editing, that would be there into developer console, isn't it? Once you save that and once you ask, you go to Control E and then you go to execute anonymous window, you ask to execute that program. That generates a request. Before that, everything is onto the client end. So that request which is ready to be get executed, it is used to hold that. How many of them? Enormous, infinite? No. There is a limit. There's a short limit, very small limit. What is that? Five ready to execute job, 5 requests can be submitted to Apex Q when server is busy with processing the another one. After what happens when R2 get processed, when the response for R2, when the response for R2 gets generated, when the response, so meanwhile, while you have submitted request R2 and response was about to, so you also have submitted R3, R4, R5, R6 like this. And after that, it comes the response of R2. So after response R2, server would take another request from Apex Q. Server would always take request from Apex Q. Then it would start executing R3. उसके बाद जब भी R3 खत्म हो जाएगा उसका रिस्पॉन्स भेज देगा, फिर यहाँ से R4 को उठा लेगा, फिर R5 को, एंड लाइक दिस. इस तरह से ये पूरा execution asynchronously चलता है. So main difference between synchronous and asynchronous is like, in a synchronous operation, the request, whatever you generate R1, R2, that directly goes to server. R1, R2, R3, जो भी है. And because server could accept only, accept only one request, so it would always, if you have another request, this request would get pending in the client still. Because the request whatever you send it directly to server. And by the way, server, the runtime engine can only process one request at a time. So that's what happened in synchronous. And then in asynchronous, the request what you are submitting that does not goes to the server directly. Rather, it goes to another place, Apex Q. And everything, whatever server is executing, it always takes from Apex Q. Understand? Even though if you have single request, you just have R1, that R1 would first go to here. And from here, it goes to server. Server start executing that R1. So this is what is the difference between asynchronous programming and asynchronous. Between synchronous and asynchronous. So we have 4 different forms of asynchronous programming. Batch program, schedulable program. These 2 are program, these 2 are classes. Future method, queuable method. So there are literally 4 topics and one small topic called flex queue as well. That's just a theory. Flex queue. So that is what we are going to learn. So by tomorrow, I'm going to start with the bash program. I'll start straightly with the bash program. What is a bash program? What's the purpose of writing a bash program? How does the syntax looks like to be? And then later on, we'll take some questions, programming questions on that. That's all for today. Any questions from your side? Please go ahead. Any questions? Any questions?